Hello and welcome to another walkthrough here. This is the chapter 5, really quick overview of the social media text, which is titled Strategic Use of Social Media and Strategy Planning. But today we're actually going to talk more about how social media is used to drive value, creating value for consumers, for the company, and for many others. So before I dig into the value driving perspective, I did want to show and talk through this graphic really quick, or this flow chart, I guess you could call it. And this is the idea of how communication has historically worked and marketing overall, in the idea that for hundreds of years, pretty much until really recently, the traditional method of communication marketing was done in terms of that top gray arrow, and that has been the company talking to consumers, and that has been all that it has been. There has been very little in terms of feedback, review, um, anything at all coming from the consumers. While there have been this idea of word of mouth, that has been something, in referrals, those have been things that have existed as long as time. The official communication flow was always from company to consumer and really nothing else. And that has changed over the last 10 or so years, 10, 15 years, where now we see a social media marketing perspective where consumers can talk back to the company, and consumers can talk to other consumers in an amplified manner. And that's where you see those arrows in the bottom half of the screen. And that also is the foundation for a discussion on uh, delivering value. Because when you're developing a strategy with social media, you want to think about these different flows of communication, who's benefiting from the communication and from the social media. But then also thinking, when you look at strategy for social media, different companies use it for different reasons. The two foundational reasons, and how I used to teach this, was that social media existed for one of two broad reasons. One was the ability to drive revenue, of course, that where social media was used to actually drive sales. And then on the other side, companies would use social media to build brand awareness. That's where you saw thought leadership, driving authority, establishing authority, and really just kind of building up a brand in the way that people viewed it. I've since taken a different approach to that. It's a little bit more ambiguous. I don't think it's quite as clear cut. And by looking at this chart here too, you can also see that both the brand awareness and the revenue driving, they're not clearly defined here. But also, the big takeaway here is that social media should not be a one-way street. It should be back and forth. It should not be one to many, the whole one to many company to all the consumers. Rather, it should be more of a conversation and a back and forth discussion. So we'll skip over this slide. This is really just a kind of an overview. We have a couple slides, but I really wanted to get into the value driving perspective here. That's really the crux of this slide. And again, I don't want to spend too much time. I'm not a fan of going through all lecture slides, but again, sometimes these slides, especially in the social media text, they do require a little of additional context and not just, hey, here's a bunch of slides for you. So think about any social media strategy, and it all starts with asking the question, what are the objectives? What's the goal? And once you have figured those out, you want to think, okay, you might have a list of 10 things. What are actually going to deserve the attention and resources? And that is where we start thinking about the resources that are required to make strategy successful. But also, we want to think about things that might happen in the background that you're not considering up front. And that is the indirect value driving mechanisms that could be popping up. The value driving perspective, if you look at the definition of it, it's really just asking yourself, okay, hey, what is the positive and valuable element that's being provided to the brand here? How are we getting value out of it? Now, the value will go in multiple directions, but the value driving perspective thought process here for the brand is how are we getting value from it? What is it that we're getting? Are we getting sales? Are we getting brand awareness? Are we developing brand equity out of this? Those are the questions to ask up front, and those are probably what the C-suite and your higher ups are going to care about the most. But you, as the person who's executing it, you might be on the ground floor, you might be a couple levels up, you might be in management. It's also going to be important for you to think about how this applies to the other side, which we're going to get to in a moment. Now, you want to think about your goals, and we're going to talk about the old SMART goals here. You've probably seen these before, either in undergrad or in the grad program. These will be on the exam. These are also, I believe, are on the chapter quiz. I don't need to go through every single thing. I think we know what these are. I will just really quickly go through a couple of examples. You want to think through, let's go backwards, time-based. Clearly, you need a date. Put some time around these things. If your goal is that you want to see 10% growth, which is measurable, what is the time frame for that? Ever? All time? You want to do it in a week? You want to do it in a month, in a year? That's really important to consider because you need those constraints. And without putting some sort of additional context around the idea of, hey, 10% growth, that's going to need to be defined further. Now, 10% is measurable, so that handles the M part. But then also, is that a realistic goal? How has growth been happening over the past 365 days? How has it been going over the past couple of months? What kind of resources do we even have to meet these goals? That's the realistic side. Actionable means that you need to actually be able to do it. That's more on the resources side. And also it needs to be something that you can do, make it tangible. 10% growth, you need to define that further. Okay, 10% growth, does that mean followers? Does that mean engagement rate? Does that mean sales? Does that mean brand awareness? And if it's brand awareness, how do you measure brand awareness? So actionable means that it needs to be something that you know what you need to do to hit that. And then significant, of course, that's making sure that it's actually going to matter. Like, is 10%, does that make a difference for us? Is it a small step on the road to making a difference for us? Obviously, you want as big of a following as possible, but you want to be able to define what makes something significant. For me, when I talk about social media with clients, I say, hey, you want to start building up a base of engaged followers and building a community. And this content needs to be value driving first, valuable to the consumer first, and it should be salesy later. That's a much later thing. And we'll talk about that, the formula for posting content that is self-promotional and not self-promotional on social media later. But you want to think about the question, what makes a goal significant? For me, it is the goal right now that you're setting, this 10% hypothetical that I have here. That is not something that may be significant up front. Your boss, the founder, the C-suite, even external shareholders, stakeholders, they may not think that is a big difference. But what you need to do is you need to think about, okay, if we do get 10% growth and we are developing a community and we can get some engagement here, and then the time comes down the line when we do need to promote something self-promotional that is going to lead to a big difference, say, hey, we're going to start selling a new product on social media. You want to be able to capitalize on that and mobilize your followers so that you actually get some sales out of it. And if your goal on social media is to drive brand awareness, but then you do have one moment in time, say you're working towards a big sale in September around Labor Day, you want to be able to, you want social media to actually contribute to that and not just be something that sits in the shadows. And for you to get there, you need to set some SMART goals, some measurable, actionable, realistic, and time-based, so that when you do get to that later date, those actions become significant. So in the definition of a SMART goal, you want these seemingly smaller steps, these smaller goals, to contribute to a larger significant movement down the line. Because with social media, every goal that you set has to be significant and truly moving the bottom line, as we've talked about recently in the last week's lecture, you're going to really be setting yourself up for failure. You need to set yourself up with smaller campaigns, smaller goals that will work together so that when the time comes to really see some tangible movement, thanks to social media, that you can do that. Now, if we think more about who's getting value when, you need to make sure that not only the company is getting the value, but also the customers. So when you're looking at that, you're looking at the types of interactions. You want to think about the target audience. What do these people care about? What are these people going to give a follow for? And then what are the different costs and benefits, of course, the old pros and cons list. But then another thing that you want to think about is risk. And the textbook, and I do agree here, that one of the bigger, like, sure, risk of getting canceled online is huge, and saying something wrong on social media can be disastrous. But what is almost as bad, maybe as bad, is that nothing happens, and that you put all of these resources and efforts into this big campaign on social media. You're thinking, this is where we're going to make it big. We're going to get all sorts of attention, and then it falls flat and nothing happens. That is an institutional failure of social media as well. Now, before we get to those main questions, you may immediately be thinking to yourself, that's ridiculous. Of course, the risk of adverse negative consequences is worse. And that may be, but that doesn't always end up something. Adverse consequences, negative consequences, negative PR is not always truly bad PR. I look at it from the cynical standpoint of, you think about some brands that have had problems recently on social media. Some of them are major and absolutely disastrous and are hard to come back from. The Burger King tweet about the women in the kitchen thing, yes, that's a big L for Burger King and is absolutely horrible. Similarly, anything that is insensitive or tone deaf, those are big losses. But on the other side, when you think of things that are a little bit less not as problematic, like I think it was PBR tweeted out some some curse words in a row, and you think about it, it's like that barely, like, PBR, I don't even think really cared. There was public outcry, people saying to cancel PBR, but if you thought about who PBR's target market is, and the fact that they weren't really saying any, like, they were just throwing out at some explicit words, there was nobody that they were truly offending in terms of their target audience. It lasted for like a week, and then it was perfectly fine. For me, I would like to see, if I was going to go back to get my doctorate, I would like to see the impact of social media disasters on brands' bottom lines, or even if we could measure brands' awareness and brand equity. Because to me, there are certain types of faux pas in social media that are terrible and are absolutely going to damage a brand long term. But there's others that, if anything, only help a brand long term because they are in need of a resurrection. I think, and you can talk about that from any standpoint. There's people that thought that the Will Smith slap of Chris Rock at the Oscars was staged because he was about to win his first Oscar for best for a leading role in a film, and yet it was one of the films that, in terms of worldwide acclaim, he was barely registering on the radar for. But then he goes up on stage, slaps Chris Rock, and now he's the number one name in the world. What does that do for Will Smith's brand? It's probably not great, but at the same time, his publicist is thinking Will Smith is back on the radar. People are talking about him again, which they had not been doing in a long time. So there is absolutely an audience that looks at both angles there. There's an audience that gets value from that different ways. I don't really have an opinion one way or another. I think It really is dependent on the case, like what's going on, what the situation is, what was said, what was done, what the damage was, and who the audience was that was actually watching it. But when you look at risk, there are two risks. It's not just negative consequences, but to me, what is just as bad, and personally, what I've seen worse, what I've felt worse about is when you spend all this time and effort trying to build up a brand through social media and then nothing happens. So the last couple of slides, they each have 4 questions about the key questions of asking in social media strategy planning. The textbook likes to tell you that, hey, you should ask all of these questions when developing a social media strategy. I don't think you need to ask all of them. I didn't highlight any specific, but I will say this. First off, a lot of these are going to be addressed in further detail later in the textbook, especially ones that deal with analytics. Secondly, we've already talked about some of these. We've talked about target audiences. We've talked about value propositions. And there's going to be a lot more about developing a social media strategy in the next couple of chapters. However, I am going to give you 4 questions specifically that you need to pay attention to for the exam, for those of you who have watched the video this long. First off, you have, these 4 questions on the first slide of these 4 slides, these are all going to be important and they're all appearing somewhere else in the text. So I'm not going to look at these. But what I am going to look at in terms of actual things that you need to pay attention to and that you should probably write down to have ready for the last week of the semester, it's going to be these 4 here. What content do we want to have in our own social media and our own social media channels? Is it going to be self-promotional? Is it going to be promoting other content? Is it going to be third-party content? What is it? What kind of content do we want to have? Second, how are we going to differentiate, or do we want to emulate competitors in the social media space? You see Wendy's did this on Twitter where they kind of created a whole new persona. They were very edgy, very different on Twitter than you might see when you're in a Wendy's placing an order. But since then, you've seen other brands starting to do the same. Hence, Burger King and that ridiculous faux pas that they had. McDonald's is trying to do the same thing, although they've really struggled. And then you have other random brands that are trying to do this because they want to gain attention and notoriety, and they think that they're creating value for their target audience. So you need to think about, are we differentiating or are we emulating, and how do we do that on social media? Next, we have the social interactions that need to happen. Do you need shares to get this? Do you need, are you looking for replies? Are you looking for likes? This is an analytics question first and foremost, in that you want to think about the different analytics that can occur on your social networks, and you want to think about which ones are we actually going for. Not saying that you want to create clickbait, not saying that you need to create really edgy, polarizing questions that'll get responses, or the old LinkedIn poll questions that are just ridiculous and get a ton of answers. But you want to think about, okay, what is it that we need to have? Because that can help you make some tweaks and small incremental changes to the way that you're posting so that you can actually get that kind of engagement. And then fourth, we have, how do we ensure they actually take place as desired? Now, what this means here is thinking about it kind of as a follow-up to number 7, in that if you're going to ask a question on social media and you want people to engage with it, you probably have a way that you envision that happening. If it's on Twitter, to keep that example going, maybe you want people to give you a quote retweet with their answer, or maybe you want them to just reply in the thread. On Facebook, chances are you're going to get comments in response to that. Not as many shares happening on Facebook as you see with retweets. And then you have on Instagram. Instagram is a little bit more nebulous because you have so many different types of content, all of which are very limiting in terms of how they can be reacted to. Reels are the big thing right now on Instagram. If you post a reel, you're going to get a lot more views and engagements than you would with a story. But then what do you want out of that? How do we ensure that the social interactions from question 7 are actually occurring as you want them to? And again, these occur through the the way that you are messaging your content, as well as the placement and the format that you're doing it. The last example I'm going to bring up here on this is, say that you're utilizing TikTok, and that's one of the easiest social networks to use, create content, and then share across other social networks. But say you create your brand has a TikTok channel, you create a video, and you're thinking, okay, I want to post this everywhere, and the social interactions that we want are shares. We just want shares on these other channels, so it looks like an original video that's getting shared as a TikTok video across these other networks to reach our other audiences. Say you want that, and you create a video that is very shareable, and you've posted it across your different networks. But then you only end up getting actual comments, for example. You're getting social interactions, but you're not getting the right ones. How do you make sure that it's leading to shares? There's a lot of different ways to do that. You can put something in the video itself. You can provide incentives, which we get into in Chapter 8 with user-generated content. There's all sorts of different ways that you can ensure that that happens. And again, we're not going to go into too much detail, but questions 5, 6, 7, and 8. This is slide 18 of 20 on this lecture slide. These are the 4 questions of the 16 that are not anywhere else in the course in a lot more detail. Again, these first 4, these go without saying. These are described in depth elsewhere. These 4 here, I mean, I think these are just redundant. I also think the when and where is handled in the next chapter when we talk about social media planning. And the last 4 are pretty important too, but these are more focused on resources. And the step-by-step plan and timeline, that is also addressed later. These 4 questions, these are the ones that are really only put into practice and really addressed in depth here. And so these are the 4. If I ask you a question on the exam that says, hey, which of the following is one of the key questions to ask when creating social media strategy, this is one of these is going to be there. So just wanted to give that Easter egg here as we wrap up today. So that will do it for this chapter. I don't have a walkthrough or any deep video for Chapter 8 in the content marketing text. I think it's pretty straightforward, pretty self-explanatory. There will be a video next week that goes into more detail on social media and utilizing some of those additional content forms. So that is all that I have here. And if you have any questions, as always, please feel free to reach out.